Hi, everyone. This is Miranda with the Valuable Voices podcast. I'm excited for you guys to hear from Melissa Weber today. She is co host of Come to the Table podcast with Amanda, who you heard from last week. So I'm really excited to have you on, Melissa. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here and I appreciate you inviting me on your show.
Yeah, this should be fun. Again, we got Amanda's perspective. So now it'll be fun to kind of talk to you. I'd love to hear, again, kind of how you grew up, whether it was in the church or not, and then what led you to, start Come to the Table podcast.
Yeah, so I did grow up in the church. I grew up in the Lutheran church and in a real, I don't even want to use the word strict, just a very structured
Yeah.
Christian home, which I mean, gosh, the blessing of that, and as an adult being able to look back, I mean, sometimes as a kid, you're like, oh, my parents, but as an adult, you realize what a blessing and a gift it was to have that structure, which is why I don't want to use the word strict.
Yeah.
But something that happened, as a teenager is I always had like believed that God existed and it all made sense to me going to church and like the way that this is how you should live and all of that. But when I was a teenager, I ended up going to a different style church and things were explained just a little differently. And Jesus was offered as like your Lord and Savior and that you could accept him. And not that that wasn't in church, but there wasn't like a connection to a personal relationship. And so at 13, 14 years old, um, I really was given this new perspective. And I was like, wow, that made it all click. And so that's when I accepted the Lord. Um, and really shortly after that, it started to well up in me a difference between, not that there's anything wrong with the Lutheran church, but just the things and the way that the services were versus the things that I was starting to see in the Bible. And I was like, okay, well, this feels kind of like a funeral and the Bible sounds more like the celebration of life. And so at a young age, trying to reconcile those two things, it really kind of led me on a very interesting journey. And then you combine that with being a rebellious teenager and whatever. So, I do a very typical strict Christian home. I'm going to go figure it out for myself story.
Yeah.
Um, and that did not end very well. We'll just say that, so at 29, left really searching and broken and just having experienced a lot of the downslide of life. God met me in a very vulnerable place and he really showed up. And from that moment on, I've just been seeking and searching him only, and trying to reconcile, what's in scripture and who God is and his heart with what goes on in life and all of that. And so I think a lot of that led to how we started the podcast. The podcast really started on accident, which I know you heard from Amanda. Like it was COVID. We started a Bible study. We were going to put it out there and somebody's like, hey, I'm going to listen to it in my car, but I can't watch Facebook Live in the car. So,
Yeah.
and I'm like, the funniest part, just our age difference between Amanda and I had to go to her and be like, do you know what a podcast is? And she's like, yes. And I was like, okay, well, I don't. And
Oh,
so,
I love it.
yeah, so that was awesome. And then just the journey of the podcast has been incredible and the things that God has been doing through that. So I've been excited for that.
Very cool. I love that. Thanks for sharing all that. And again, I know some people can probably relate, right? Growing up in a Christian home, figuring out for yourself, asking questions, jumping from church to another church, having different people in your life kind of guiding you. I love
Mm-hmm.
that. So tell me about Come to the Table podcast. I kind of got Amanda's point of view, but I'd love to hear yours. Again, what's been going on with it? What are you guys talking about now? How has it grown? All of that.
Yeah. So with the podcast, I didn't realize how much of a tool it would be for the ladies involved, for our own spiritual growth. You know, our desire to have tough conversations and challenging conversations, thought provoking conversations, the things that we felt, in our experience, like we weren't not necessarily not allowed to talk about, but things that were like, oh, well, we'll just say God's got it and that should be good enough. And that just never sat well with any of us. And so the conversations we were having in our study of the Bible, like amongst ourselves, were different. We started to notice a disconnect of like, well, why are we feeling like we need to censor ourselves when we're okay and fine in our relationships having these conversations? And so we really wanted to bring that, bring other women into that. And that's been probably the biggest thing for me, is just how much it's personally impacted me, but then to see that it impacts other women. And so much to the point that now we've grown into reaching out to help other women along through the podcast. And so we started like a media company just to help other women be like, hey, like if this is, get your voice out there. Yeah. And I feel like you're a proponent for that. And that's why you have us on your show, which is, it's awesome. Like we live in an age where we can be so connected to everybody and meet people all over the world and gain a true like worldview and perspective and have conversations. And that's just raw and authentically what we want to do at Come to the Table. And so I'm sure Amanda told you we started out as like the Hot Mess Express is what we called season one. And it's so true to form. And then we really started to like dive into topics, and then we really started questioning our faith. And I know with like coming through a pandemic, a lot of people have been doing that. I think it's been a very eye-opening and challenging experience. And so you get to hear our journey through that. And so, which everybody's coined that term, deconstruction. And so, but for us, we got to a point where it's like, no, we're going to have to sit down and really figure out where God is at in this and not abandon him in a sense, but seek him even more fully and more open-mindedly, and maybe get rid of some of the thoughts and ideas that we had that are from a human perspective and really try to gain what God's heart is. And so now going forward with having the media company, it's like as much as Come to the Table is everybody come and let's have these conversations, we now want to help foster people that are having conversations in different ways or different medias. I don't know where God's going to take that, but just how much in the last 3 years that he's really grown what we've been doing, which boggles my mind entirely.
Yes. I love it. Just one step at a time, right? In faith. Yeah. And I mean, there's so many good nuggets there. I love just kind of the vulnerability, kind of just coming to the table as is, asking the hard questions. I love community, right? I mean, gosh, especially during the pandemic and just the loneliness and the where is everybody? I mean, you can talk to people on a screen, but just to have that community of women, especially just like, how is this for you? Just to bounce ideas off of. And then, of course, I love the media company and just the voices. I mean, that is my heart is look, all of us have a story and we just need to get out there and share it. And it may be, you don't compare, but somebody might write a book. Somebody might start a media company. Somebody has a podcast. It's just getting that story out there. And like I was saying earlier, it just builds your faith to hear God's stories, God's doing and what he's doing in people's life. And then like, what about me? Why not me? So I love that. I love that.
Yeah.
You shared a little bit about ADHD. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, that has been probably my biggest struggle. And it kind of piggybacks on what you were just talking about. We all have a testimony. We all have a story. God works within each of us so uniquely. And there's somebody out there that needs that. They will not be able to, maybe they've had 20 people tell them, the same thing, but you come along and you word it in a way that it just makes sense to them. And that happened for me specifically with ADHD, is always trying to reconcile, how do I function in this life when it really does look different and it operates different from the way that I am relating to the world. And there's so much negative connotation on that. And personally, feeling like I'm incompetent or a failure because there's things that I just can't do. And we do, especially as women, we fall into that comparison trap. And you're like, well, this woman is succeeding, greatly. And here I am, messing it all up continually. And I'm trying to do the things that she does. And I mean, even personally between like Amanda and I, Amanda's a very organized lady. She keeps me so on track with this.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. But for a long time, knowing her, I would be like, okay, she has a chart. She has this,
Right.
and I would try to mimic that, but it wouldn't work for me. And then I did discover an ADHD coach for adults. And I started reading her blog, and the way that she worded things, I was like, oh, that makes total sense. And
Yeah.
so that was a very turning point. But I took that perspective also just into life of like, yeah, God has got a purpose and a plan for everything that we've all been through.
Yeah.
And even if it's a struggle like adult ADHD or even having children with ADHD, we need to not limit what we can do and say, there's a way to do it. It just might take me 4 extra steps, or I could still do all these things. There's a way to work around it. And my process is going to look different than your process. But it doesn't mean that either of us is wrong in that. And then, yeah, in our testimonies, it's the same thing. My experience and the things I've walked through, you might not have done the same way, and you might not think about that situation the same way. But there's somebody who, by my sharing my story and you sharing your story, is going to be like, I get you. And
Yeah.
that's exactly the piece that I needed to move forward. And in my life, the story has been that there's been women who have spoken into my life and who have said, this is the way, let's go over it. Jesus is this way. This is how this looked in my life.
Yeah.
And it has made huge differences.
Yeah.
And so the ADHD part is understanding that like there's tools out there, there's things that are available, and to stop like condemning ourselves
Yeah.
over these things that, yes, my mind processes things different. Some of it's great,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
look at a lot of times like a superpower.
Yeah.
I'm in the restaurant business. That is the perfect place for someone with ADHD.
Yeah.
And even like my staff and coworkers and stuff, they're like, how do you like know what's always going on? Or like, and I'm like, because I hear everything. Like,
Yeah.
and it can drive you crazy because I'm focusing on so many things at one time, but it turns out to be a blessing because I'm like, I heard that.
Yeah.
You can't get away with anything. But yeah, and I think just whether it's any type of thing that limits you or that you feel puts a limit on you in life, it doesn't
Yeah.
have to be ADHD. Stopping to realize that God has a purpose and a plan in it, and that there is a way, and He is working in that. And we need to really just sit down and allow Him to work through those things so that we can bring real transformation into the world as a testimony.
Yeah. That's so good. Again, comparison is horrible, right? And
Yeah.
being on the negative part of something. I mean, God made us a certain way. He made you very different than me. We can learn from each other. We can take the positive. I love that you can be like, well, I can do this, right? I love that. And similar to your story with the church, you heard many different things, but then you went to a different church and they said it a different way. Again, that just goes to you're telling your story and being open, maybe having to hear it 15, 20 different times, but in a different way at the same time. I love that. Awesome. Well, I know, let us know where your podcast is, how we can find you, and then, yeah, we'll wrap this up. I love it.
Yeah. You're gonna kind of get the Melissa version versus the Amanda
I love
version.
it. You're two different people.
Yeah, because I always got to ask her, how do you find our podcast? I do know, we are on Facebook at Come to the Table Podcast, and we are on, like Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio. My biggest one, we're on Apple Podcasts, which that was a big milestone for us. You could always find us through our website at come to the table podcast.com, I think is what it is.
Love it. Yeah.
You
We'll
go
put
back and listen to Amanda again. She'll tell you I'm not
so funny.
I've never felt honestly like more old and disconnected with technology than lately. I'm like, you could do what with your phone? Like, it's awesome. So
Well, that's
Um,
why we have other people in our lives, right?
yeah,
Partners, friends that are show us and help us along the way. I love that. We all again have
exactly.
different skills. Some are more
Yeah,
challenged than others. It's okay.
yeah. But I always just put it in the search bar when I try to show people, and it pops right up. It's pretty easy to find. So,
Perfect. Well, keep doing what you're doing. I love it. It's just, again, just such a blessing to connect with you all and meet you. I love just encouraging and cheering other women to do what God's called them to do, and just use your voice because people are listening and you're making a difference in people's lives. So thanks for doing what you're doing and great to connect.
well, thank you, and right back at you. Keep doing what you're doing, and it's been good. And I've enjoyed being able to discover the stuff that you've got going on. So what God's doing through your life. So thank you too.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for being
Uh-huh.
on. Thanks everyone for listening. Have a great day.
Bye. Thank you.